Good morning, community, and welcome back to Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, C-Suite Trusted Advisor, Board Director, and Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Strategy Consultant, helping members of the C-Suite and their teams reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. So, community, you know that I always love every guest that I have, but do you see this extra wide smile? I cannot help myself because I have my dear friend, mentor, business collaborator, Dr. Deena Brown with me today. And Dr. Deena, thank you so much, number one, for your grace with me because we have done so many projects together. I just knew that you had already been on the program. So thank you for forgiving me for just now getting you here, but we're here and I'm excited to have you. How are you today, ma'am?
I am phenomenal and excited to be here. It's always a pleasure to get the opportunity to connect and work with you. So I'm excited.
Well, let's get going. We have just finished celebrating Juneteenth in the month of June, and now we're leading into July 4th. Let's talk about the transition between those two holidays and what they should mean to everybody in America.
What they should mean to everybody, I can't speak for everybody in America, but I do want to draw attention to that those are two holidays that have two distinctive narratives of what it means and feels like to be free in American history. And that is that acknowledgement that needs to take place first and foremost. And then also recognizing that both of them also have an additional element to understanding America's full history that we have. So two distinct holidays that really kind of resonate about what freedom could mean or does mean, and then also how they kind of contradict a little bit too about what freedom means in America's full history.
So let's talk about that contradiction for just a minute. What do you mean? Because I find that intriguing.
The contradiction means, since we've just celebrated Juneteenth, I'll start there. And now we've been to go back to really thinking about what does the 4th of July represent? And they're just several weeks apart. So when we think about Juneteenth, it's the acknowledgement that we now, meaning we collectively African Americans, have awareness that there's freedom, that the civil war is over, that there's freedom. So there's an awareness. It actually had already occurred, but there's an awareness that sits there. And when it became a federal holiday in 2021, I feel like this was an acknowledgement of the African American experience. And so that in itself is another space of acknowledgement. But when we think about the 4th of July as a whole, we think about that sense of independence and the fight where we did actually have African Americans fighting to be free as Americans at a time that Black people, and I'll speak about Black people and Africans in America, not being able to be free in the full sense of the word. And so when I think about that contradiction that exists, is that at a time in 1776 that we were fighting for our freedom to be free, look how long it took to even to be recognized with a sense of awareness to be free.
When I think about those two words that you specifically use, awareness and acknowledgement, the word that comes to my mind is acceptance.
Yes.
How many people, either subconsciously or intentionally, have not yet accepted what it means to have us here in this country, the country that we built, were forced to build, but yet are not allowed to fully participate in some instances? What do you think about that?
There's so many things that come to mind, so I have to pause to even collect myself in that moment as I pull it back together. Because when we think about acceptance, is that ownership and understanding of freedom first starts with self for me. And so when we think about how our cultural identity exists externally to who we see and say we are, that's what stops me initially. We talk about acceptance, because do I truly have cognitive understanding of who I am and what I am and how I show up in being accepted in America, right? Being a Black woman in America, and then have to extend that out externally. those are the things that are kind of like drumming like in my mind, and even like kind of getting, to your question. And so I don't have like this finite answer, because that cognitively swirls when we think about being in a space where our hair has to be still legislated. So
yeah, to the point that we have to have a Crown Act.
Correct, right? And as a Black woman that wears her natural hair in locks, so that's kind of what's going. Has it really been accepted? Do I still have to kind of mask? I know we've talked about it before. Am I still kind of showing up as a bastardized version of myself? Am I truly, honestly free to be the holistic version of myself? Or is this all a facade? Don't want to get too philosophical and deep with that, but that's kind of what was going when you asked the question about what does it actually mean and what does acceptance means. And I think that we have made strides, but we still have such a long way to go.
We do have a long way to go. And that said, we have a long way to go in this wonderful series of real conversations from the C-suite. So I don't want to unpack everything right here, but I do want to get back to what you just said about acceptance. And for me, acceptance requires a willingness to have independent thought and follow it. And so that being said, let's take that as a segue to Independence Day. And I know that artificial intelligence is something that we are both interested in terms of how that's going to impact the workplace, specifically in the human resources or human capital department. And what comes to my mind is the independent thought that AI is either going to fix everything or going to wreck everything, one of the two. What are your initial thoughts on that?
So one of the things that I want to also level set when we talk about AI, are we talking about generative AI, which now has the creative construct to create new content, because we have machine learning, we have different versions. So I want to set context that what I'm going to refer to as generative AI as being that tool, and that as a large language model as a whole means that there is inputs that have to go in for it to be able to give a clear like output. And so when we think about the role of African Americans, the role of our documentation, we think about the challenge over teaching even critical race theory in America, and what the fullness of our story is, meaning that the inputs into our large language models, like ChatGPT and other generative AI, can be distorted and biased and bigoted. And so what does that mean when we're utilizing it as a tool to create and to reason and to partner? And so it has I'm a proponent, I'm a fan. I'm a fan, but I also understand that it is a tool partnered with you as a human is really important. So it's not an end all, it's not a be all, it's not a fix all, but it can act as a tool to give you what I call your superpowers to do things, faster. But I also think that especially people of color and those of that really want to add additional context to the history of us, that we need to input that information into these large language models so it has a reference point. So if we don't have, I'm sorry, because I can get into that. Go ahead. I
know you can, but before you do, I'm going to let you go in a minute. But before you do, I want to go back to something that you said about the bigotry and the bias that's inherent in AI. And I know that that's a concern of a lot of people, myself included. I think what we don't take into consideration is that whether it's a homogeneous group of white males that are creating the applications, or whether it's a bunch of diverse people, you're still going to have that risk of bigotry and bias, because everybody has it. So as long as these systems are developed by people, regardless of their race, their background, their creed, their color, their religious affiliation, what have you, you are still subject to the output of things that are built by humans who naturally have bias.
Absolutely.
So before we let the community think we're saying that white males are ruining this, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is everybody has bias. And so we have to be aware of that. And to your point about partnering with these tools, we have to make sure that if we take the 75 or 80% solution, we as individuals go in and humanize the outputs that are based on artificial intelligence. And yet we still have to manage our own bias in addition to being aware of the biases built into the system. Yeah,
absolutely. And as educators in this process, you have to consider it as you're educating this tool that you are working with, especially in the generative AI space.
Yes.
And that is the additional iterations and the conversations that you have. So even conversational AI is what we can speak to as well, is that these are conversations that you're having. What are you saying? Where is it pulling it from? Are you course correcting? Which is why it always says, check.
Yes.
Check.
Fact check, especially. Yes.
Check. So you still have to have bias mitigators, and you still have to have your antennae up when you're working with this. So it is not an end all be all. It is not something that should be making decisions on its own. It's something that could aid and support, and what I call a sense of augmented intelligence to do that. So how can I do what I do from a process improvement, from a productivity improvement, from all these different spaces? How can I do that and do my work, what I need to do to add my magic to the world better, faster, with a thought partner, But again, understanding that the most critical piece of generative AI or any AI tool that you're using is the human component.
Yes. And my concern is that we're going to get away from the human component. I know a lot of people are concerned that, okay, well, if I've got a team of 10 and generative AI wipes out, 7 jobs, what am I going to do? Well, first of all, I don't think it's going to go that far. To your point, I think it's going to be used as a tool to partner and help us think faster and give us time to do the things that human connection requires. That being said, if a team of 10 goes down to 3, you still have to think about the interactions, effective interactions between the humans that are still left. So that being said, it kind of brings me to this thought. A lot of people are kind of getting a little worked up about generative AI, but if you think about it, years ago, when I was in HR for a while and we were reviewing resumes, there were the keywords. We had programs to help us, pull out the resumes that had the most keyword hits. Maybe you had 50. The system would identify 5 with the most keyword hits, right? And then a person would go and actually read the resume. So if you think about it, in a sense, generative AI is not that new. It's just a new form. What are your thoughts on that?
It's not new at all. You've been utilizing AI, large language model things, even having conversations with Siri. When you're on your phone, there's recommendations. There's all you've been. AI is the umbrella term,
right,
for all of these other pieces that sit. And so we think about the capacity of generative AI, which is taking off. And I wanna make a connection, because it ties back into when we talk about, are we truly free? And we think about even the suspicions and debunking, the myths around AI. I liken that to, especially people of color who tend to be like late adopters to this, as to, you've been free, you've had access, but you weren't aware of that. And so if we collectively, when I say the collective we of people of color, especially Black and Brown communities, do not engage and upskill and reskill ourselves in AI, it will be like that Juneteenth, that 4th of July. The rest of the world's been celebrating 4th of July, and we're still waiting for the announcement that we're free. So I liken some of that mindset around the adoption, the engagement, and also like the fear that surrounds that. Because when we think about what was happening, I know we start this conversation shifting from Juneteenth, going into like the 4th of July, and thinking about what are the paradoxical elements to that, is to think about what does it really mean for me? Am I ready to be on my own, to use this word? That can be leveraged and is transferred. And some of the thought processes, the neurological understandings and trigger points, I'm going to say it, can be rooted to enslavement in America and enslavement of mind. If someone has your mind, they got you for the rest of your life. And so if we don't begin to look differently and begin to engage differently, then we'll have that same thing that is going to take how many years for you to realize that you are free. So I want to get like too deep, but I just kind of wanted to pull that out. Yeah. Talking about the two as we transition into those conversations of what does it look like? Those are those connections to that. So I'll kind of like pause there, because I'm telling you, there's this critical lens that we need to begin to look at, all of the things of how we've been able to engage in technology, tap into innovation, all of that, especially as people of color, Black people, as a whole, and that there's some of those reservations, those wives' tales, and some of that talk track that doesn't align to us is really to keep us in bondage instead of to set us free. Right? We fought for in the very beginning.
Well, community, we're pausing here, not just so that we can all have a break so that I can unwrap my mind from some of the things that she said. Dr. Deena is one of my favorite people to just have a conversation with. We have had conversations that have gone, hey, how you doing? Just want to check in with you. And an hour later, we're still on the phone because the way she frames a thought, the way she conducts a conversation. Well, you've seen it. I don't have to tell you. So we're going to pause here, but please come back for our next conversation where we're going to explore the current landscapes specific to DEI in the workplace. And you definitely want to come back for that. So in the meantime, please feel free to go back and listen to this podcast and, you know what, engage in these types of conversations in your workplace. To hear this again, you know where to go by now, to the website, dranita.com. Remember to make sure you spell out the word doctor. At the top of the landing page, click the link that says Keeping It Real Podcast. And while you're there, please feel free to check out my services and my resources. In the meantime, please help me by getting in the flow, follow, like, and overshare any conversation that helps you reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.